the podcast is just the one thing that everyone there has in common. And of course, we talk about podcast episodes, but I love it when someone will just go in that group and post something on their own about a story of themselves or a question, and you get a bunch of other people. I feel like, man, this is so great. I brought these people together, and now they're engaging with each other and helping and enriching each other's lives. It's very gratifying.
Albert Einstein said, "Don't think about why you question, simply don't stop questioning." Welcome to Curated Questions. I am your host, Ken Woodward. And these questions are not mathematical equations, but rather a resource to encounter personal reflection and growth. As Tupac Shakur stated, even the genius asks questions. Now, let's engage the questioning community. Greetings. Ken Woodward here. Welcome back to another episode of Curated Questions. Together we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I am a fellow traveler and a pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you are here. Now, before we officially begin, I'd like to add a trigger warning to the start of the episode. Just after the 41-minute mark, there is a 5-minute segment where Scott shares about one of his episodes that recounts a tragic story, which includes death by suicide and the death of a child. Graphic details are not shared, but the story is heartbreaking. Now, we do cover a lot of ground in this conversation, and it picks up with a happy story right after that. And I'm sure this episode will prove to be unforgettable. I hope you enjoy. Today's conversation is with Scott Johnson. Scott is a curious listener and natural connector. He started the Computer Tutor in 1999 and then expanded to include a compendium podcast, which he hosted for several hundred episodes. Driven by an insatiable desire to understand what extraordinary experiences feel like, he created the What Was That Like?, a nationally recognized storytelling podcast. Scott transitioned from computer business owner to full-time podcaster in 2018, co-hosting with Meredith Edwards to present firsthand stories from people who have survived unbelievable circumstances. Scott has mastered the art of creating safe spaces for guests to share deeply personal experiences, animal attacks, plane crashes, mass shootings, and other life-changing events. His genuine curiosity and ability to ask the right questions draw out intimate, honest conversations that tunnel straight to the heart and vulnerability of each story. He doesn't skim the surface. He creates connections that often move both storytellers and listeners to tears. Scott demonstrates through his work that storytelling has immense power to preserve memories, inspire action, and create a lasting impact. His approach shows that everyone has a story worth telling, and the right questions can unlock profound human connections. I walked past Scott at a podcast conference and noticed the question, "What was that like?" on his baseball hat. I absolutely wanted to talk with anyone willing to wear such an inquisitive question out into the wild. Scott, welcome to Curated Questions.
Ken, it's great to be here. And I found it interesting that you said you walked past me. I think you were stalking me as I was coming out of the bathroom, as I recall.
Well, to be clear, it was walking past you first, then the stalking began.
Gotcha.
So
okay.
It was a two-part thing.
Okay.
I'm glad you brought that up to
Timeline
full
is important.
transparency. Yes.
Good.
For the record, though, I didn't really stalk you bad in the bathroom. So, it could have been worse, I suppose.
Oh, man. I have a policy of never trying to engage with someone who is busy with other work in the bathroom. So I agree with you on that process.
That's probably a good practice, I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed.
Yeah. You do have a captive audience there, but
that is true.
That's not really fair, though.
Yeah. I'd like to start off with the same question. When did you first understand the power of questions?
Interestingly enough, I found this to be at podcasting conferences. I don't know if you have noticed this, but a lot of podcasters are also introverts. And I don't know if it's the fact that we are home alone talking into a mic by ourselves, and that's where we're happy. Of course, in my show and your show, we're talking to other people as well. But I've just seen I've had a lot of podcaster friends say, yeah, I'm kind of introverted. But at a conference, the easy thing is to just say, hey, what's your podcast about? And that question just opens the whole door right there. Because what do people love talking about? Themselves. And especially at a conference like that, they want to talk about their podcast. That's one of the reasons that they are attending, probably. And people love talking about themselves. And that's the whole point of my show. When I have a guest come on my show, they're telling a story, a very personal or traumatic or happy story, that's something that happened to them. But the key element, when I ask someone, what's your podcast about? You have to be interested and really listen to what their answer is going to be. It's an easy question to throw out, and it gets a conversation started, but you've got to have an interest in it. Don't just ask it because you don't know what else to say. But that's where I find it so easy to start a conversation that way, especially at a conference. If I'm just in a crowd of people, a random group of people, like at the mall or any place else, unless I see someone who something's going on and I clearly have some kind of a connection with, I usually wouldn't start a conversation. I enjoy having conversations with strangers, but it's usually not in my process to just approach somebody and start talking.
You mentioned that you perceive some kind of a connection is when you would start those conversations most often if you're in a crowd. Do you ever go out intentionally looking, kind of a heart posture, if you will, to go, okay, I'm going to go have some conversation here? Or is it more just circumstance? You're like, hey, you see somebody with the same ball cap or something like that. How does your curiosity show up that way?
I love that question. And you must be the master of asking questions because your whole show is about this. But yeah, there's a perfect example of that. We are members of Costco, and my wife doesn't enjoy going to Costco on Saturdays because it's just incredibly crowded and it's like wall-to-wall people.
Yes.
That's my favorite time to go to Costco.
Really?
Yes, because I might run into someone and I might have a conversation with someone. I can't wear it now in the summertime because it's too hot, but I have a hoodie, and you've probably seen these. On the front, it says, "You are enough." But on the back, it says, "Dear person in line behind me, the world is better because you're in it. Sincerely, the person in line in front of you." And that has sparked some conversations. So yeah, I specifically go to Costco sometimes for that purpose, but I'm open to other times as well. If I see someone who has an interesting tattoo, I'll probably ask them about it because I have a couple myself, and I'm always interested in tattoos that seem to have some kind of meaning, not just like the barbed wire over the bicep kind of thing, but something that seems to mean something to that person. And in almost all cases, they're happy to talk about it. What's the history? Why'd you get that? Matter of fact, I've thought about starting a YouTube channel where I just approach people and ask them about their tattoo. I don't know if anybody would listen to that or not, or watch it, but
I would assume that there's a market, and probably actually kind of surprised that somebody hasn't done it already.
They probably have. I haven't researched it enough to know that, but I think it would be interesting. It's something I'd watch anyway.
I don't have any tattoos and just hadn't figured out what I would want to wear for the rest of my life because I just keep changing. So I guess maybe it's capturing a snapshot in time, or if you did the tattoo podcast or tattoo show, then I could watch it and I could learn why all these different motivations or kind of what the Venn diagram is for figuring out what kind of a tattoo to wear.
I'm the same way because it's permanent. But yeah, maybe that show would lead us through the thought process of some people who have actually gone through that. And of course, there's people that have tattoos that they regret now as well. But I didn't expect us to talk this much about tattoos today.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Never know where it's going to go.
Indeed. So let's dive into what started the show for you, or the transition when you said, yes, I want to start. What was that like? And if you give some of the history on when it started and what the impetus or the origin story was.
Sure, absolutely. This is actually my third podcast. I did one for my computer business. Then I did one kind of in between. I did 88 episodes of a show called Ultra Finishers, which is interviewing people who have just finished their first ultra marathon. And so that kind of gave me some practice on interviewing people. And then my third one I started in 2018. And actually, you mentioned that I made the transition to a full-time podcaster in 2018, but that's when I actually started the show. But full-time was like 5 years later, like 2023, roughly, because you have to grow an audience and all that. And but here's what I realized back before I started the show. I really enjoyed the podcasts I loved listening to are the ones where someone's telling a story. And it made it even better if it was a true story. And I looked around and I would see episodes sometimes where that would happen, but I didn't see any shows really doing that, at least not how I would do it. And there's a podcast that I listen to. Do you know Dave Jackson?
No.
Okay. He runs School of Podcasting. He's at almost all the conferences. You can meet him, but he has a podcast every Monday, the School of Podcasting, and where he talks about how to grow your show and just everything about podcasting. He has a separate show called Building a Better Dave, and he calls it his own free therapy. So he just talks about stuff that's going on in his life, doesn't care if he has any listeners or not. It's not a big show, but I know him personally, so I kind of like listening to that because it's personal to him. Well, there was a time when he was talking about his dog, Dudley, and he had had this dog forever. And it came time to put Dudley down. And for anyone that has ever had a dog or any kind of a pet, that day is the worst day of the year. I don't know how he got through it himself without crying, but I was on my way to a client, a computer appointment, and he's talking about the minute-by-minute narrative, and then Dudley was here, and then he could see his eyes close, and he was gone. And I've always had dogs, and I've had to do that myself, so I could identify with that so fully. I get to my client's business, and I'm in the parking lot crying because I'm hearing this story. But that's what kind of made it so real to me, when a story can bring out that kind of emotion from people, from the listeners. That is so powerful. And so I thought, okay, there's nobody else doing this like I would want to do it. I'm going to do it myself. I already know how to make a podcast. I just have to find people and get them to tell their story. And so that's what I did. I decided to start doing that. And it was July of 2018. Had the first episode. I got really lucky on the first episode. It was a woman named Jennifer who accidentally killed someone. And that was a gripping story. She was in her car with her two little girls. It was nighttime. She pulled into an intersection, not seeing the motorcyclist coming from her left, and he ran into her car. She was in the street with him as he was unconscious, and she's calling 911. And I actually got the 911 audio and played it in the episode of her. And this is when we spoke, when she told this story, it had only been about 2 years. So she was still in trauma mode. She had PTSD from it. She was eventually acquitted. She wasn't charged with anything because she wasn't on her phone. She wasn't distracted driving or anything like that. They don't know why she didn't see him, but there was just so much to unpack in that episode. You know, all the, not just the trauma of being the cause of this, but having to tell your little kids, mommy might have to go to prison, and the legal bills, and just so much to talk about. And that was the very first episode. And it was kind of crazy to start it out that way. So, yeah.
Wow. That is launching with power. That is for sure. Wow.
Yeah.
Now, have you followed up with her at all in the years in between to know how she's doing?
Yes. We actually still do stay in touch. And this has been 7 years ago now.
Yeah.
I encouraged her to start a podcast, which she did. It took a lot of nudging. But if you think about it, what's the best kind of podcast to almost ensure growth? It's when you have a niche audience, but that audience is really big. And so her target audience is people who have gone through what she has. Now you think about how many people have accidentally killed someone. Not really very many, but there are multiple fatal accidents across the country every single day.
Yeah.
And she talks to those people. She also talks to experts, therapists, people like that can come on and address various issues. And she also wrote a book about it. I've actually had her on the podcast again, just as a follow-up. I do what are called flashback episodes, where if someone's original appearance was more than 3 years ago, I'll have them back on. But first I'll play the original episode, but then I'll play like a 10-minute conversation that we've had recently, like what's happened since you came on the first time. Because listeners ask me, hey, remember so-and-so? I wonder what's happening with him now. Hey, you ever talk to him anymore? And so it fills that, because I only do new episodes every other Friday. So the flashback episodes fill in on some of the empty Fridays. And people that are just discovering the show may not have heard the older episode. And it's evergreen content. These stories never grow old. So I'm just playing them again and answering that question.
Well, that's cool. And I like the practice that you have of doing the follow-ups for those that have been with you for a long time, right? Kind of hitting that little bit of a refresh button. And no doubt it'll be a little bit nostalgic, because where were they when they heard this impactful story the first time? You know, there's probably, it's probably going to trigger a memory of who they were. And after they get through the first initial thing of, dang, that was 5 years ago. So much.
That's always the way it starts.
Okay.
Can't believe it's been 5 years already. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm assuming that the guests, or how you find your guests, is just a scatter shot of referrals of people hear your stuff. Any particular primary way that happens?
Initially, I had to find them all myself because nobody knew. Matter of fact, even Jennifer, the first episode, she kind of took a chance on me because I had no audience at that time. She was the very first episode, and I'm forever grateful to her for that. But yeah, in the beginning, I thought about, okay, who do I want to have on my show? And so I just started making a list of weird things that happen to people, like somebody that got struck by lightning, or someone that was in a house on fire and somebody rescued them, just various things like that. Then I would go looking for news stories that were fairly recent, or not fairly recent, but within the last couple of years anyway, and then just try to contact those people. And in many cases, I would try to contact them on Facebook, because most people are on Facebook. And when I'm looking at the news story, I would always hope that that the main character would have an unusual name. Because if you go on Facebook looking for John Smith, no way you're going to find that person.
Right.
But someone with a unique name, and you can see they live in the city where this person was, and maybe even see a picture. If there was a news article and they showed their picture, then I can match it up, and then I try to contact them and get them on. That's the way it was originally. Now the audience is big enough that most of my guests come from the audience, people who have listened to the show for a while, and they finally think, oh, wait, I got a story. Maybe this will work. So they send it in. There's a form on the website where you can fill out and send it in. But I also get contacted by a lot of PR people and publicists. People, somebody had something crazy happen, and now they've written a book about it. So they're really trying to promote the book. But I would still have those people on. I just make it clear up front that most of the episode is going to be you talking about what happened, and we'll definitely talk about the book at the end and your website and your coaching service and all that. But it's going to be a small section at the end, because that's what my audience tunes in to hear, crazy stories. And so that's what we focus on. Yeah.
Gotcha. Are there any particular stories that are still on that list that you haven't checked off yet?
I should have had, I'm going to pull it up here on my computer right now. I do have some. I'm looking for someone ever since the beginning of time. I've been looking for this, someone who survived falling off a cruise ship while it was underway. That actually just happened this past week. I don't know if you heard that in the news, but it was a Disney cruise. A little girl fell off into the water, and her father jumped into the water also off the cruise ship to save her. And then the cruise ship had a smaller boat that they went out and they plucked him out of the water. Usually people don't survive that.
Yeah.
But there was controversy about this because there's a whole Reddit thread about it. And people are saying, what's the real story here? Because it's very difficult to just accidentally fall off a cruise ship. And so they're assuming that the father was taking a picture and put the little girl up on a rail to take the picture, and then she fell off. And now they're saying, this guy's not a hero. he should be charged with a crime for doing that. So I don't really want to get involved with that story so much, I don't think. Unless there, I mean, I don't want to assign guilt when nothing really is known yet. But
Right.
I would like to talk to someone who was a passenger in a car when it was hit by a train. Someone who was a prison employee in charge of execution. Let's see. Someone who's not a firefighter, but ran into a burning building and rescued someone. And I'd like to also talk to someone who's not an airplane pilot, but was on a flight where the pilot had a problem and they had to land the plane. Someone who just got talked through from the air traffic radio to, okay, here's what you do. That would be crazy. And I know that's happened, but yeah, so there's a few that I'm continuously looking for. And there's a few more on that list too, but those are the crazy ones.
But appreciate the kind of the specificity of it in that, I mean, I know through your episodes, you've got such a wide range of things that have happened to folks, but this is really necking down to the things that really are uncommon.
Right. Well, yes, they kind of are, but it's uncommon in the fact that most people probably don't know someone that's happened to. But if you think about all the stuff that happens all over the world every day, there's probably every day somebody gets rescued from a burning building. It's unusual enough that it's a story that people would want to hear. And that's one of the criteria when I'm choosing, if somebody sends me a story, you know how when you subscribe to podcasts on your podcast app, a new episode will come up automatically. But I don't listen to every new episode of every podcast that I subscribe to. You know, you kind of cherry pick. So I'm picturing my listeners as they're looking at their phone and they're scrolling down and they see a new episode. I want their reaction to be, wow, okay, I got to hear that story. So that's why I title them the way I do. I kind of tell sort of what happened in the episode without giving away the whole story. You know, like Dan was mauled by a grizzly bear. I'd be interested in hearing about that. That's one of the criteria. Unfortunately, most of the stories that get pitched to me, I have to reject them just because they're not unusual enough.
And just thinking for the individual, it was absolutely unique to the individual of whatever it was. And it's like, I've got this crazy story and you're like, I actually had 6 more in the inbox this week from somebody else that said the same thing, but that's unique to you, but not necessarily to humanity.
Exactly. And that's the awkward part of it, having to reject something like that. So I had a lady early on send me a message saying, hey, I've got a story for your show. I was walking out my front door one day and I fell down the steps and hit my head and I had to go to the emergency room. Yeah, that's the whole story right there. But see, that's the awkward part. I don't want to minimize it. I'm sure it was traumatic for her. Right. But it feels weird for me to say, yeah, I'm sorry that happened, but it's not interesting enough. It's not going to hold my audience for an hour telling that story, you know?
Right.
So,
well, how many stairs was it? Were you at the top of the Empire State Building and then had to roll down all 100 or 200 stories or whatever it is?
Wow. Yeah, it's not going to take long enough. And that's actually one of the questions too. I say in telling this story, we shoot for an hour. It's got to be at least 45 minutes. So do you think it's going to take 45 minutes to tell the story? And in some cases it's not, but some people will come back and say, oh yeah, I think, yeah, because we can talk, like in this particular case, we can talk about when the house was built and what the front porch looked like. And well, none of that's interesting.
Right.
It's got to be the meat of the story has to take enough time, you know.
How do you go about creating this safe space? And what is your process for that? Or not, maybe even not a process, but just how do you think about creating this place in this conversation that folks are willing to walk through or perhaps re-experience some of this trauma? What do you do intentionally for that?
It's easier now than it used to be. Because anyone now who's thinking that they're thinking, okay, I have this really traumatic story and it was the saddest day of my life. And I know I'm probably going to cry while I'm telling this story. Do I really want to go on and talk to Scott about this and tell that story? The advantage now is that they can listen to 200 episodes of how I've handled that kind of story. And my natural empathy comes through. So they can recognize that, yeah, it's going to be a safe space for me to tell my story. And it doesn't matter if I get emotional or, I mean, I've had somewhere I got emotional. And so people know that. But that's also one of the reasons that prior to the day we record, I do what I call a sound check. And it's under the pretense of making sure the audio is okay, because most of my guests, they're not set up in a sound studio. They don't even usually get interviewed. They just had this one weird thing happen to them, and now they're telling a story about it. So we have to make sure that their audio is okay. And that is one of the things we check on. But another big part of that pre-chat is to make sure they understand that it's going to be comfortable for them to come on the show and to talk to me, because we connect for that pre-chat the exact same way we do for the day we do the recording. We have the conversation. So they can see me, they'll interact with me face to face. And I tell them, we don't record video, it's only audio. So they don't have to worry about making sure their hair looks okay and that their room is not cluttered and all of that stuff. But then I also, this is something I learned from one of Tim Ferriss' episodes. He gave this example, and this is something that I do in the pre-chat, in the sound check. I tell them, this is not done live. It's going to be edited. So if you need to take a drink of water, or if you need to pause to think about how to answer a question, or anything like that, it's all fine. Those things are going to get edited out. And what I say specifically is, as a matter of fact, sometimes I'll ask a question and I'll just completely screw it up. And so when that happens, I'm just going to say, okay, I'm going to back up, ask that question again. And I start over, and nobody ever hears the mistakes. So by me saying that, saying, hey, I'm going to screw up here, that's me being vulnerable, which means they're a lot more likely to be vulnerable as well. And that's what makes a good episode. When the guest is, they're always nervous to start with, but usually within 5 or 10 minutes, they are just into the story, and it's just me and the guest. I never tell them the size of the audience, but at the time when we're recording, I'm the only audience. They're just telling their story. And in a lot of cases, they've never actually told that story from beginning to end in detail to another person who is deliberately and focused, intently listening to everything and interested in it. I've had many guests say that it was therapeutic just to be able to tell that whole story. And I love that. I thrive on that.
How do you think about your follow-up questions? How are you working through the story with them in following your curiosity?
Yeah. I usually have multiple pages of notes in front of me when I'm speaking with a guest. And that's why on my website, when it's on the form to fill out telling your story, the thing that I emphasize the most is I need all the details. I know it's going to be more work, and I can't guarantee even then that your story is going to be a good fit for the show. But to increase your chances of it being workable, I need all the details. And so I take that and I make my own notes. I always divide it up into 3 sections. First is like the before it happened. Who was in your family? Who was in the car with you at the time? How old are your kids? Where were you going? That kind of thing, just so it kind of sets the scene for the listener.
Yeah.
The second part is the biggest one. That's like a minute-by-minute narrative of what happened, the incident that we're talking about. And then the third part is since then. How have you recovered? Have you had therapy? All of that kind of stuff. How did you get through it? And what are you doing now? Because so many people now are advocates of what happened, raising awareness so that the same thing doesn't happen to other people.
Right.
And so that's a big thing. For a lot of people, that's the message they want to get out. And so we definitely talk about that too. So that's my process. What was the question that you just asked me again?
Yeah, it was just how you follow your curiosity.
Yes.
Through,
Okay. Right.
as they're telling the story.
Mm-hmm. When I make my notes, I make really detailed notes so I can guide the conversation. Sometimes they'll get off on a tangent, And usually I'll let them do that, just knowing that I'm probably going to edit that out, but that's fine. I don't want to interrupt people and say, hey, no, let's get back to the story. That kind of can throw them off a little bit.
Right.
But yes, when I'm making my own notes, that's when I try to insert my curiosity, because as we're going through what happened, I would include the question in my notes as, what was going through your head at that time? What were you thinking? Or, as you were approaching the swimming pool, not knowing if your toddler was at the bottom of the pool, what was that self-talk like? What were you saying to yourself? And because I try to put myself in their shoes, and that's the advantage of having a natural empathy. If I can put myself in their shoes, what would I be thinking at that time? And that's what I want to know. And if I don't have a real clear visual, not just of the logistical things, where everything was and how this happened, but the mental process, I find that part, I think, is the most interesting to me. What happens inside the human mind when trauma is being introduced? Or not just trauma, but how about extreme happiness or surprise? All of those things. I find that really interesting.
How do you think that this has changed you?
Part of the way it's changed me is in realizing that these conversations are possible and that I enjoy them so much. This is like my dream job. Being able to make people feel so comfortable that they can open up completely. And I think it's opened my eyes to, wow, I really like doing this. And for some people, like, for example, my wife has never listened to a single episode of my podcast. But it's because she gets anxious knowing something bad's going to happen. And
Gotcha.
so it's not for everyone, and that's fine. Not everyone is your target audience. And that's the case with a lot of family and close friends. They're not necessarily your target audience. That's okay. But for a lot of people, this kind of thing I try to make it really compelling content, and I don't shy away from sad stories because that's real life.
Yeah.
If it was a movie, yeah, everybody's happy at the end, but this is real life, and that doesn't always happen that way. I still try to end on a positive in some way, but the story itself, it doesn't always end that way. So people really never know. I think that's part of the attraction. They don't know, is this person really going to lose someone, or what's really going to happen?
Yeah.
Because there's some stories where I know what happened, but I tell people, like, somebody might be falsely imprisoned and they're talking about the last day before they went into prison. They were saying goodbye to their loved ones or to their wife or someone. And then they might throw in, and that's the last time I saw freedom for 16 years. Well, I don't want that at the front of this episode, because I want people to not know how long they're going to be in there yet, because that keeps people interested in the story. It's the same reason James Bond doesn't kill the bad guy in the first 5 minutes. Why keep watching the show after that, or the movie? So, yeah, I like that helps keep people interested.
Harkening back to the good old days of Paul Harvey and, the rest of the story.
Oh, yeah. Right? You always had to wait till the end. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't know how it's going to roll.
Mm-hmm.
I think a beautiful thing about what you're doing is that, because it is just the real life stuff, where the TV is Hollywoodized, embellished,
formulaic.
And it's like the real stories just do have so much power, and you giving these stories the time to express themselves, it is cool. And you mentioned going into some of those details where that's the first time that this whole story has been listened to the whole way through. Because no doubt, if they're talking with their family, the family knows the backstory.
Right.
They think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or it's assumed that the family knows why you were there, but maybe there's a little bit more, and just to be able to tell the entire story, I would think would be quite cathartic for folks that come on and talk through things.
Yeah. That's what they tell me. I had a woman who was, she and her boyfriend deeply in love, and she already had a couple of kids. He was great for them. And then she woke up one morning and he had died in his sleep. And that's how she discovered him. There's so much to that story. One of the things that she told me afterward is, it's so nice now to know that all of those details are preserved, because over time you forget some of these things. Yeah. And she didn't want to forget anything. And now it's documented, so to speak. And that was a tough one to listen to as well.
Yeah, in this world of sources to inspire empathy, I think that your show would be one to do that.
I hope so. It's one of my goals.
What are a couple of your most outlandish or favorite episodes, or at the top of the list of stories that you retell when you're doing conversations like this?
Well, I made a note of a couple, but now that you included the word outlandish, I may need to add another one to this. Because one of the common questions I get is, what's the weirdest story you've ever done? And that one, it's an easy answer. It's a man who experimented with cannibalism by eating his own foot. So just a quick summary. This guy had a group of friends. They would all sit around, ask questions and have discussions and everything. One of the questions that came up one time was, if you had the opportunity to taste human flesh and it was legal and ethical and maybe even healthy, would you do it? And most of them said, sure, why not? Yeah, I'd do that. Knowing obviously it's never going to happen. Well, this man had a motorcycle accident and he had to have his foot amputated. And when he was leaving the hospital, he asked for his foot. They still had it. And so they had him sign disclaimers and paperwork and stuff like that. But he brought his foot home with him. And then he started calling his friends saying, hey, remember that conversation we had? And they were all up for it. So he had a group of about 10 friends over. One of his friends is a chef, and he has pictures of all this as well. And they had what they called foot tacos. And it wasn't a meal. It was like a 2-inch square of, the foot. And they ate it. And so that's the weirdest one. I have some of my listeners say, I've listened to all of your past episodes, but that's the one I can't listen to. It just sounds too gross. But when people listen to it, usually the response is, that wasn't as gross as I thought it would be.
When we first met, you'd mentioned a little bit of that. And my initial response was, no, I wouldn't try it. But then I thought about my answer and I was like, am I giving that answer because I think that's the right answer versus would I actually? And to your point, this is now legal, right? So we're setting aside all the normal things that would prevent, taking a bite.
Right.
Now, with my memory being what it is, I would never really recall the flavor profile or anything like that. So I'm like, but it's given time. I don't know. I may, or actually I'd probably do it just from a dare standpoint. So that's probably where I would end up at.
Okay. Breaking news here on the podcast. Ken is a potential cannibal here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad I'm in control of the sound bites on this from my end, at least.
Right, yeah.
Now, once this gets out on the internet, then we never know where it'll go. But just from inquiring, I'm like, why am I saying that? And what is pushing me on the edges of what my real motivations are?
Right. Yeah.
And really digging into that. So I found that of interest, as I expected that this piece of the conversation would come up, is that why am I saying yes or no? Is it a health reason? Is it a moral reason. But the big scheme of things is that pretty much any animal that folks consider sacred are dogs or cats. There's someplace else in the world where that is held as truly sacred and wouldn't be touched. But it's like, okay, in a controlled setting, what does that look like?
Right.
And what are the constraints?
Right. Yeah. Is there anything objectively wrong with it? But that's a really good question, though. It requires some introspection to think, is it just cultural? Is culture so ingrained in me that I just know that it's wrong, but maybe it isn't wrong? But I love the idea of expanding your mind to think, maybe I was not always right about that. Maybe this is not such a bad thing. I'm not saying it is or it isn't in this particular case, because he turned it around on me at the end. He said, well, what about you? I did this, but would you eat human flesh? And I thought I was off the hook because I said, well, I'm vegan, so I don't eat meat. So that answers the question for me. But he said, no, wait a second. Vegans are that way because the animal cannot give consent. In this case, the full consent was given. No person was killed for this, and it's all legal and everything. And I still declined, saying I probably wouldn't do it. But, given the situation, who knows?
Yeah. Well, that is amazing how he turned that around and didn't let you off the hook.
Right. Yeah.
But he was also informed about it, right? So he didn't just, okay, well, I guess he gets a get out of jail free card on this question or an automatic pass. Nice twist in the conversation there.
Yeah, I was impressed. So anyway, so that's one. When you mentioned Outlandish, that's the one that came to mind. I do really sad stories, and I also do really happy stories. So I would give an example of each of those. I had a woman named Laura who lives in Virginia. She and her husband, Aaron, had a little boy, Anderson, who was about 1.5 years old. Laura worked from home. Aaron worked in an office. Anderson usually went to daycare. So Aaron was on his way to work to drop Anderson off at daycare. He went on to work. And Laura, working at home, thought, I haven't heard from daycare in a little while, a few hours. I'm going to just call and check in. And the daycare said, Anderson didn't come in today. And so now she has no idea what's going on. She calls Aaron at work saying, where is our son? And that's when he realized that he forgot to drop Anderson off at daycare. He went out to his car and Anderson did not survive.
Wow.
And so Laura doesn't know what's going on. She's trying to call Aaron repeatedly. He's not answering. Finally, he answers and he says, I'm on my way to the hospital. Meet me there, and hangs up. She doesn't know what hospital. She doesn't know anything. So she drives to his work. There are ambulances, policemen everywhere, but no Aaron or Anderson. That car's gone. Well, what happened is Aaron went to their home and on that same day took his own life because he could not fathom, what he had just done. So Laura lost her whole family unexpectedly in that day. And she came on and told that story. And it's the one where I get emotional. And partly because since then, Laura and I have become really good friends. And I talk to her almost every day now. And she has also started a podcast. And that's the bright part of her story. She's now an advocate for backseat technology. Like you get an alert that goes off if you get out of the car and leave and there's still a child in the back seat. The easy thing is to just throw your cell phone in the back seat, because even though you may not remember that your child is back there, but nobody can go without their cell phone for 30 minutes, which seems kind of crazy, but it happens. And it happens. The funny thing is, Laura, prior to that happening, was one of those people who were very judgmental and thinking, how in the world, something as precious as your child, how can you just forget them? But she and Aaron were wonderful parents, very loving parents. But that's part of her story, is it can happen to anyone. And it does. And so, yeah, she's gone and spoken in Washington, D.C. She has her own podcast. She's done multiple episodes, interviewed people who had what she called close misses or close calls, where they did leave the child in the car, but then they remembered 5 minutes later and came back out and the child's crying, and it could have been disaster, but it wasn't. And so she, from this story, has saved lives herself just from raising that awareness. But yeah, that's an incredibly dramatic story.
Wow.
On the other end of the spectrum, you got questions. Go ahead.
Just real quick. So thank you for being able to hold space for that, to be able for that story to exist out there, and obviously all the good that's come out of it. But I mean, that is a massive story, and to be able to be present and witness that. So thank you.
It was one of my most impactful episodes. And part of it that I haven't mentioned yet is that I had a surprise for Laura partway through the episode. So if anyone wants to listen to that, you'll hear that. The episode is called Laura's Pain Became Her Purpose. And I love surprises, and this was a really good one.
Excellent. As always, I'll put everything in the show notes. I'll tag that one specifically. I'll tag all the episodes that you've mentioned. That way folks can either easily find it through the show notes or obviously appreciate the title. So as folks go to your website, then they can find that as well.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Then
all
we
right.
had
yes, you said a happier one.
I got a happy episode because we do those every once in a while. I like to throw those in just to lighten the mood because it can be pretty dark sometimes. But yeah, this is a woman named Fabiana. And she, as a college student, lived in Southern California. And on a whim, she decided to go and be in the studio audience for The Price is Right, back when Bob Barker was the host.
Yeah.
So she did. And she got on the stage as a contestant, and she won the showcase. And that's exciting, that's fun. How many people have done that? Not many people. She went back again 10 years later and got on the stage and won the showcase a second time.
Wow.
And you can only do that every 10 years. That's the rule that they have if you've won a showcase in the past. Well, more recently, 10 years later, during COVID, if you ever watched The Price is Right during the COVID times, the studio audience, it's like tables of 3, and they're all kind of spread out because of the social distancing requirement. She got on the stage again and won the showcase a third time.
Wow.
Yeah. See, that's an amazing thing. And also on the website, in the episode notes for this one, we've got video of each of those appearances. So first time was Bob Barker, and then the second 2 times were with Drew Carey because he was the newer host. So that's a fun one.
Yeah. How have questions worked in your life?
Well, I love asking questions. And obviously the podcast is where I get to ask all the questions. The funny thing is, though, when I'm editing a show, depending on how the guest answers, people might never even hear my question. Because that way, if it sounds like they're just continuing to tell the story, I'll just edit out my question because the audience doesn't even need to hear it. And that way it makes the guest sound like a professional storyteller because they just proceeded with continuing the storyline. So I love doing that. It makes them sound really good. When I'm asking a guest questions, I've made so many notes ahead of time that I almost always know the answer to the question already. There have been a few times when I didn't. Like a guest might, when they're writing out their story and submitting it, they might just mention something offhand, but then I can include that as a question and ask them, what were you thinking when that happened? Or were you feeling apprehensive? Because they might have said that just as a side note in their submission, but they might not even remember that they told me that. And so it sounds like I'm just asking out of my own curiosity when in reality, I know that's what they were thinking already, but it gives them the opening to really flesh that out. What was really going through their mind when that happened?
Were you asking a lot of questions as a kid?
I was very curious as a kid. I don't know that I asked a lot of questions, though. I would go digging for answers myself. When I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, we lived in a kind of a rural area of Ohio, and it was summertime, and we had a push lawnmower, and it's just stopped working. I was always kind of interested in stuff like that. And my dad replaced the lawnmower, but he said, yeah, you can have it. It doesn't work anyway. What's the difference? So, well, it was a Saturday morning, and it was one of those kinds where you had the ripcord where you kind of had to wrap it around and then give it a pull and to get the engine started. And if it didn't work, you got to wrap it around again. And I was so persistent in just, I had no mechanical knowledge at all, but I was so curious what made it work before, and now it doesn't work. And maybe it's just something that obviously it's something that I don't know about because I had no knowledge of how engines work at the time. But I remember my dad was watching out the back kitchen window and just seeing me pull that thing over and over and over again. And it actually started just from my persistence. I just didn't give up. So he couldn't believe it because he'd already bought the new lawnmower. Now the old one's working again. Or at least it worked that time. I don't know if it continued to work or not. But I would take things apart. Always interested in radios. There were new computers back then. I would take apart radios, and I got my ham radio license when I was 16. So I would sit in my bedroom and communicate with other amateur radio operators all over the world. And that kind of satisfied a lot of my curiosity. And I don't know, I guess I'm not sure how else that played out other than those things. I'm sure there are other areas that I was curious about that I'm just not thinking of. But yeah, I always want to know how things work.
If I'm trying to connect dots, so you going into the computer world and fixing things and making videos and podcasts, or I guess it was podcasts, to help folks understand how to fix things, maybe an extension of that world of, let's see how this works out and try to figure it out.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah, it could be. Because my computer business is called the Computer Tutor. Because when I first started, it wasn't to repair computers. It was to teach people how to use computers.
Okay.
And that was started by accident, really. I was just walking into a print shop, and somebody had left a note on the counter saying, I need someone to teach me how to use Microsoft Word. And I said to myself, well, I know how to use Microsoft Word. I could do that. And this was like the mid to late 90s, roughly.
Okay.
And so I called her up, and I went over to her place, and we spent a couple of hours going through, here's how you copy and paste, and here's how you format. And I thought, well, doing it that time, I thought, this could be a little side hustle for me. And because I'm very patient when I'm teaching someone how to do something, I started advertising a little bit, the Computer Tutor. And this is a small town in Maine. And so everybody knows everybody. Newspaper ads are really cheap, and word gets around. So I became the computer guy. Well, what happens is after you've spent a couple of hours with someone, getting deep into using the computer, well, 6 months later, when their DVD drive won't open or their hard drive crashes, I'm the one they called, even though I didn't do anything like that. One of the first times the guy said, my CD drive isn't working. Can you fix that? And I just said, sure. Yeah. And I was scared to death opening up. Well, I went and got his computer and brought it back to my home office, but not knowing I didn't have any idea how to fix that. But I mean, it was just a matter of replacing it, and a couple of cables connected it to the motherboard, and it wasn't that big a deal. But that's how I learned everything with computer repair. It's all self-taught. So yeah, it is that maybe natural curiosity, but also just the willingness to say, yeah, I can do that, knowing that I can probably learn how to do it, because
probably figure it out.
Yeah, I'll figure it out.
Yeah.
And whenever I'm presented with something that seems really difficult, the line that goes through my head is, lots of other people have done this, and some of those people are stupider than I am. So why can't I do it?
Have there been any questions we normally think are useful questions, but then after you use them, you're like, you know what, these just aren't effective?
Something that I hear happen in so many podcasts that are interviews where the standard opening question is, hey, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I just see that as just a totally useless question, especially in terms of one of my guests. If I have someone on my show who was bitten by a rattlesnake, and I start off with that question, tell us a little bit about yourself. It's so vague to start with. Well, I grew up in Nebraska, and nobody cares. Nobody cares about that. Tell us about the snake. Get to the snake. That's what people want. I have actually been interviewed at a local radio station. Just came on, or wanted me to come on, just talk about the podcast. And that was their first question. And I said, let's not even do that. But they insisted, no, come on, just tell us a little bit about yourself. And so I said, okay, I grew up in Ohio, moved to Florida. That's my story. Now let's talk about what else you want to talk about. I try to always avoid that. It's an easy opener because the host is off the hook. It's so vague. How do you even answer that question?
Yeah. Even when you said the question as an opening statement, I'm like, as a podcast host, I know my audience better than whoever the guest is. So let me at least guide the conversation such that it's helpful and puts us on a track for whatever conversation that we're going to be having.
I know of one show where a little variation on that question is good. It's a good opener. A friend of mine has a show called Birth as We Know It. And every episode is someone coming on to tell about their experience with giving birth. Usually it's the birthing person, or it might be the partner, or it might be a provider or whatever, but they're telling all the details about from conception to postpartum. And she starts off that question sort of like that. She says, tell us about yourself and who's in your family. Because she's going to ask that anyway. Who's your husband? Who's your wife? What kids do you already have? What we were doing for work at the time, if that was relevant to the story, and that kind of thing. So that's the one that I've heard that's closest, but those are super interesting. If anybody likes storytelling, that's a super interesting show too. And I've never been that interested in birth. I have 2 kids who are adults now, but the process of birth is, those are really good stories.
You mentioned your kids. As you think back on raising them, what did the questions and curiosity look like for them from your perspective as the parent?
I remember my daughter, when she was a young child, was really curious about what her bangs would look like if she cut them off herself. And my son was curious one time because we were at home, and I don't know how old he was, maybe a little older than a toddler, but we looked over and he had some kind of pink liquid around his mouth. And we just realized that he had found a bottle of calamine lotion and drank it. So he was curious about that. And of course, we were immediately curious as to, is this poisonous or what? So we called 911, and I forget if they either called poison control or they gave us a number and we called poison control, but it's not poisonous. So, so yeah.
I'm glad that you don't need to be a guest on your own show.
That's right.
Regarding,
yes.
Yeah. Do you have any particular questions that you carry with you or that have been with you throughout life at all?
Not sure about throughout life. Usually when I ask someone, particularly a stranger, a question, it's because of some kind of observation that I've made, like we talked about the tattoos, or if we're both experiencing something, like if we're in line at the grocery store and it's taking an extraordinarily long time. You sometimes have that knowing look at each other thinking, wow, I wonder if this is ever going to happen, That might be an impetus for a conversation. But as far as like on the podcast, a couple of the questions that I always ask is, first of all, how to pronounce everybody's name. You've got to have the names right. And
Yeah.
because there are some unusual names sometimes. And who else is in the story? Who else are we going to be talking about? So I always try to get that. But then one question I always ask guests as well is there any part of the story that you don't want to talk about or that I shouldn't ask you about? And in most cases, the answer is nope, you can talk about anything. I'm an open book. But in some cases, like if there's an ongoing lawsuit, we can't talk about legal matters, or if there was a settlement, maybe that was part of the settlement. It had to be remain confidential. So we can't talk about that. But I always like to get those things out of the way ahead of time so I know what not to bring up. And even if I accidentally bring it up and they say, oh, sorry, can't talk about that, it gets edited out. It's no big deal.
We talked about empathy. In today's climate in America, it's really divisive on lots of different fronts. And hearing some of these different stories, I'm thinking your show could go a long ways in helping people to connect or to see the humanity beneath some of the identities that we so often throw up and stake our lives on. What are your thoughts on how that connection may serve?
It's so easy as soon as you hear someone talking about something that they identify with, such as a political party or a position on a certain divisive cultural issue or anything like that, it's really easy to immediately write them off. And that's part of the reason that, number one, on the show, we don't get into any of that. All they see is a human being who experienced this incredible trauma, and that could have been me. But if they know that ahead of time or somehow in the conversation it comes up that that person is a Democrat or that person's a Republican, now they no longer identify with that person. And it would kind of kill the whole story. So we don't get into any of that. And even if guests talk about it, I will usually just edit that out. But it's the same thing in the Facebook group. I've got a private Facebook group, about 9,000 people that are listeners to the podcast. And that's one of the big rules is we do not discuss politics. If you want to have a discussion about that, there's lots of places on Facebook you can go, lots of groups. But here, nope, we don't do that. I just try to keep the focus on the humanity, not on superficial and opinions. Not that people can't give their opinions, but certain subjects are just so hot that it never comes to anything good because you're not going to persuade anyone else, at least not on a Facebook comment.
Wait, what? What? You're telling me that my rant in a Facebook comment is not going to correct all of those that see the world differently than me? Oh, that's blasphemous.
That strategy,
I may have to edit that out.
It's less than 50% effective, I guarantee you. I'm sorry.
It's impressive that you've built such a community on Facebook. That is significant. That you've built into it the culture of, no, we are celebrating the humanity side of things, what we truly have in common here.
Yeah, and I love it. It's been so fortunate because I've enforced that from the beginning. And I don't even have any moderators or admins helping me with that group. I do it all myself. And that's just because people know in this group, we're nice to each other. And we ask a new question in that group every Tuesday morning, some kind of a deep, thought-provoking question. Not all of them are deep, but like if go back to a certain point in your life and change something, what would you change? Or what was the happiest day of your life? That's the current question. What's a day that you thought was, what was a really happy day that you remember? And people talking about all kinds of stuff. And everyone loves to talk. Everyone loves to tell something about themselves, especially something like that. That's something that made them really happy. There's that emotion and they want to get that out there. They want other people to hear this. It's been one of the greatest things I've done. Not that it brings me any new listeners, but people love engaging with each other and hearing other people's stories. I've actually been able to make a couple of bonus episodes from those Facebook questions a couple of times.
The podcast conference we were at, where the encouragement was to build a theater, not just a stage. And that idea of the podcast as a stage, yep, you still have that, but it's the back room where you get the VIP experience, but you also have out front of the theater in the lobby where the community gets to engage.
Mm-hmm.
And that Facebook group sounds like a beautiful example of that lobby where the community gets to engage with each other, celebrate what's going on the stage. But this is where all the like-minded folks can get together and live life together, celebrate each other. So
absolutely.
I mean, well done on developing that.
The podcast is just the one thing that everyone there has in common. And of course, we talk about podcast episodes, but I love it when someone will just go in that group and post something on their own about a story of themselves or a question, and you get a bunch of other people. I feel like, man, this is so great. I brought these people together, and now they're engaging with each other and helping and enriching each other's lives. It's very gratifying.
Priya Parker does lots of great work regarding gatherings, and she's got what she calls magical questions. And it sounds like what your community is encountering are these similarly magical questions that just really foster community conversation, fun, and celebration. Yeah. Did you start the Facebook group like straight away once you started the podcast, or when did that come along?
It was pretty soon after that. Yeah. And that's been my primary call to action at the end of each podcast episode. Hey, if you're not in the Facebook group, come on over. It's free. Join the other listeners there talking about episodes and talking about all kinds of other things. And I've actually turned those questions into regular episodes. We have an episode called The Tuesday Question. I have a co-host, Meredith, and I will go in and look at one of the past Tuesday questions.
I listened to a couple of those. And so let's give a shout out to Meredith, because she's got her own podcast as well, right? And
she does.
So if you can just walk through what your rhythm is, and then also it gives an opportunity to shout out what Meredith is doing as well.
Absolutely. I have a new What Was That Like episode every other Friday. And it's been every other Friday for 7 years. Never missed one. But on the weeks in between, I will have, on a Friday in between, I'll have either a flashback episode, which is with a previous guest, which I couldn't do for quite a while, first 3 years, it's too soon. Now I've got lots of content for flashback stories, but that still leaves sometimes another Friday that's empty. And more recently, I've started another format. It's just called Scott Tells a Story. So I find some kind of an unusual story online. Usually these are like 10 or 15 minute episodes, but it's just me telling the story. And so this way people have something coming from me every single Friday.
Gotcha.
And then on the weeks that I have a new What Was That Like story, on the Tuesday of that week, that's the Tuesday that Meredith and I have an episode called The Tuesday Question. And we each answer it. We read some questions and comments. And Meredith has her own show, which is called Meredith for Real, The Curious Introvert. And goes back to the same I was mentioned earlier, that podcasters are often introverts. And she definitely is one, but she's super intelligent and she's funny. And she has guests on her show talking about things that normally you don't hear discussed in regular conversations with adults. Like she had one not too long ago about foot fetishes. And so she had an author who wrote about it, a doctor or a psychologist who specialized in it, and she had the spouse of someone who has a foot fetish. And they all talked about it. She had questions, and she really does a good job. Anyone that enjoys my show would almost certainly enjoy her show.
Gotcha. And how did you two meet?
We met at a podcasting conference. That's the first time we met in person. Prior to that, she had contacted me saying, hey, why don't we do a promo trade? Because that's one way to grow your show is you make a 30-second or 60-second trailer for your show for another show who has a similar type of interest, and you just play that on each other's shows. So we had done that. And then finally we met in person in Denver at a podcast movement conference and just realized that we had a really good chemistry, had no thought or plans of having any kind of a show with a co-host at all. But here's how it happened. My network, Glassbox Media, they're the ones that get my sponsors and do all the negotiation, get the payment and everything, and they take a percentage. And they said, look, we've got sponsors who would like to sponsor your show, but you are a man and your audience is mostly women, which is true. And so they want to advertise products that would be appropriate for a woman to buy, but you as a man can't really do a personal endorsement on this stuff. And so I thought, okay, well, we need to somehow figure out how to get a woman involved. And that's how Meredith came in. And it's worked out great. We have a really good chemistry.
Yeah. A couple of the episodes that I listened to would agree with the chemistry. It makes for a fun listen.
Yeah. It's nice that we don't always agree on everything as well. I tend to be, show me the evidence, I'll believe it. It's science. There's no gray area here. She's sometimes more into the woo-woo kind of stuff, near-death experiences, what really happened, and she'll talk about that kind of stuff. And, we kind of poke at each other a little bit, but everyone knows it's in good fun and hopefully entertaining and maybe even educational sometimes.
Right. Well, that's cool. And it's neat to see the progression that you've had over your decades of podcasting at this point, all three, and now kind of a fourth almost by virtue of you and Meredith working together, that evolution, if you will, of your podcast journey.
It is. Yeah. It's interesting to look back on. And I often tell people when you first start a show, keep track of your numbers from the first episode. Because 2-3 years down the road, you might feel like, it's just not growing. It's not growing fast enough. But if you look at your numbers today, look at what your numbers were a year ago. And I guess it has been growing. It just, may not see it week to week, but over the long period, you should see some growth. That's encouraging.
I'm assuming if you go back and look at and listen to your first one, you're like, oh yeah, I've definitely grown.
Oh, yeah,
man. I've learned a lot.
That's something that I've learned from doing the flashback episodes, because I'm hearing myself do these interviews from 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. And the one thing I have learned, like I mentioned, I might even edit out my own question when I'm editing the show. I talk a lot less now. And so I'm listening to these older interviews with my guests, and I'm just saying, Scott, shut up. Just stop talking. Let them tell the story. So yeah, hopefully I've learned that. But, that's something you can't avoid. Everybody starts the same place. You got to learn. You got to get better. I've heard people say that if you've done 50 episodes and you go back and listen to your very first episode and you're happy with it, you waited too long to start your podcast, because the first episode is going to be crappy, which is perfect that the first episodes are crappy, because you don't have an audience then. It's not a big deal.
How I've been looking at this on the podcasting front is that when I started doing a daily blog, it was Inquiry of the Day 365, so IOTD 365. I would post a question and then I would do a writing to position the reader to more deeply encounter the question.
Okay.
That was the premise of it. And I did it for 9 months, relatively early on. I had been talking with a coworker, and she was a part of the Mensa Society, and she really liked it. But and she shared it with a friend of hers in the Mensa Society, and she said, "I like the concept, but the writing is atrocious." And so I was like, thank you for the feedback, like legitimately. And so I started using Grammarly to help me improve my writing, and my writing dramatically improved. So now I'm looking at a similar thing with yourself, in that as I go back and listen to those earlier episodes, my language is clunky, lots of filler words. And now I'm using this process very much like Grammarly improved my writing. The podcast and speaking should also, now as I go back and have to painfully do the edits through and collapse down and take out filler words, that this is doing the same thing for me in the audio and helping me to clean up my thinking to be able to speak more clearly. It's a process.
It's absolutely
And
a
it's a
process.
pain. When I edit every one of these podcasts, I'm like, dang. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So keep growing though, but it's fun.
Yeah. And you've got to be open to learning how to get better. You only learn by doing it. For people that want to be a public speaker, the advice that they constantly get is just keep getting on a stage, no matter what it is. If you want to be a stand-up comic, go do the 11 p.m. open mic night when there's 4 people in the audience. Just keep getting on a stage, because every time you get a little bit better.
Amen. Amen.
Mm-hmm.
As we move towards wrapping up, I have what's called a right now question. So this is something beyond what's for lunch or if you're going to get married. But it's
this has me nervous thinking about this. I don't even know what to expect here.
Yeah. Thankfully, there's no wrong answer. Legitimately.
Oh, okay. 42.
Excellent. And so this is, what is it, a question that you're working through in your life right now, just more personal front, or it could be on the podcast front, that is in your mind now?
I've had a big change in my life. And it wasn't like right now, but it was not too long ago where I had to come to the conclusion that I changed my whole way of thinking about a particular subject. I was brought up in a very religious household. We were Christian, and I went to Christian school from 3rd grade all the way to graduating high school. I was in the very first graduating class of that Christian school, 11 kids in that class. My parents, we were at church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and if there was revival meetings, we were there every night of the week, once or twice a year. And so, I went to a Christian college. That's where I met my wife. And so, religion, from childhood, absolutely. And then more recently, I would say probably 8 or 9 years ago, we had an event happen that made me start questioning everything. And it was an unexpected death. My daughter was married, and they were living out in Las Vegas. We're here in Florida. And she and her husband celebrated their 1-year anniversary. And the next day he was killed in a motorcycle accident. So that, as you can imagine, pretty traumatic. My wife and I went out to Las Vegas. We were out there for a couple of weeks just helping her get through this, wrap things up, all the details that are involved with something like that. And it started me thinking. It wasn't that particular event that said, oh, okay, obviously there's no God. It was the start of a process, and of just starting to think, what really is the truth? And so I did a lot of my own research. I read books. I listened to podcasts where a non-believer would talk to a believer. They would have debates and each present their arguments. And I did that for a couple of years probably. And so I came to the conclusion, I'm not a Christian anymore. I don't necessarily, I'm not saying that there is no God, but I'm saying that I don't see any evidence. I'm not convinced that there is one. So now for most people, that would be taking a position of atheism, more accurately agnostic atheism, since I'm saying, I don't know, maybe there is. I'm waiting for more evidence. I haven't seen any yet, but I don't call myself an atheist, though. I call myself a humanist. And that's because if I have to have a label, I want to be identified with something that I do believe in, which is the goodness of human beings, rather than something I don't necessarily believe in. So, that's been a big change, because I've had to look at everything I've believed about this my whole life. I don't think was true, and that's a big thing to swallow. That's why it doesn't happen quickly. It's a process. You got to work through that stuff in your mind, but that's where I'm at now. And I got to tell you, I'm enjoying my Sunday mornings, not having to be in church anymore.
First off, thank you for sharing. It hits closer to home than probably realize. That process for you on the identity side of things, can you talk a little bit about what that has looked like for you?
That is one of the biggest difficulties when your identity is so tied to your religion and the way you have been taught to think from a small child. That's just who I am. And it's really scary to think, wow, maybe I'm not who I thought I was. Or maybe my thought of who I am was wrong all this time. And I think that's one reason a lot of people have trouble getting away from any kind of religion or a cult or anything like that. It's been said most people that are in a cult don't realize that they're in a cult. And because we can rationalize things in our heads. But yeah, I mean, one of the most difficult things was telling my mom, because she's still very much involved in church and everything like that. And when I first told her, lots of tears, of course, and she said that she felt like she failed as a mother. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, I raised my own kids as Christians. And my son is still very much he plays the piano at church every Sunday. He's been an elder in that church. Having it to do over again, I would not do it that way. My big thing would be to tell my kids not what to think, but how to think, and let them figure things out. Identity is a huge thing, and you can't reason someone out of a position that they didn't reason themselves into. Like in my case, it was childhood indoctrination from very early age. You know, everything you learn is from the grown-ups. And of course they're telling you the truth. Why would they tell you something that's not the truth? And in my case, my parents did think that was the truth. They still do. My dad's passed away, but my mom is still very much convinced that our past loved ones who have died, we're going to look forward to seeing them again someday in heaven. And so that's part of the problem I have with it. You know, it's like this life doesn't really matter so much. It's just a little blip in time. The real important thing is what happens after. But for me, I kind of see it the other way. This life is the only one that we know we have. That's what makes it so precious. We got to live each moment because this is all we know for sure that we have. And so there's all kinds of aspects to discuss in that journey. But
I think at this point we could do another hour or two on this one. One follow-up question regarding courage. What did that look like for you? You said it was a process, got that. Difficult time telling your mom, got that. And yet there must have been a point where you understood that if you went down this path of investigation, and if you choose to honestly investigate this, that there may be this fracture or this breaking away, this change that's going to need to be.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember what that was like and choosing to step forward into it anyway?
Yeah. It was, for me, it was a big secret for a long time. I didn't even tell anyone that I was investigating or trying to get answers. We have an Amazon Prime account, so all of our family shares it. So anything that we purchase, we can see what each other's purchased if we go back in the purchase history. And I was buying books on atheism and Christianity versus non-believing and all this kind of stuff. I opened my own separate Amazon account just so nobody could see that I was doing that. When I would watch YouTube videos of debates and things like that. I didn't want anyone to see me doing that because I knew what the reaction would be. It would be, come on, Christianity is true. You don't have to doubt. Just get in the Word, read the Bible, pray, let God reveal himself to you. Okay. Well, I've been a Christian for 50 years. I think I've had some time. And so I knew that's what the response would be. And that's what the response was when I told people in my family. So I didn't want to have to deal with that while I was trying to do my own neutral or unbiased. I wanted to get to the truth. Because the real question, sometimes what I ask people when we discuss this is, when I'm talking to someone who's still claiming to be a Christian, if you were wrong, would you want to know about it? Would you want to know that you're wrong? Not everybody would.
Yeah.
It's so much easier just to go along, go to church, sing the songs, and do all that stuff and not make waves. But when you buck that trend and you're surrounded by people who are still deeply involved in all that stuff, well, now you're the black sheep. My mom still says, she didn't disown me or anything. She says, no matter what you believe, you're still my son. Mm-hmm. I'm going to keep praying for you, though. And she, every once in a while, will say, hey, here's a book. Have you read this book yet? And of course, it's by some Christian author. And I'm past that point. I'm open to new evidence, but there is no new evidence that I've seen. So finally, more recently, I said, look, you've just got to have to accept this. I'm not going to have these conversations anymore. It feels like an intervention. But of course, from her standpoint, she still believes everything. And now her son is going to go to hell after death. Of course, I can understand why she'd be concerned. But I can't keep having that argument over and over. You know, we just got to not talk about it. So.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, thank you for expounding.
Sure.
I appreciate the added detail there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I want to mention too, that if someone is religious, I have no problem with that. Mm-hmm. You live your life, let me live mine. But yet the atheists don't go knocking around doors trying to convert people to come to their church, because we don't have a church and we don't have religious sayings on the coins, and we don't have a building on every corner where people go to every week. And it's just, let people live their lives. And just like I don't try to convert people to veganism. That's fine if they want to. If they want to eat meat, that's fine too. I don't care. I'm making the choices that are right for me. And now when the religious people try to implement their religious laws into actual laws and that affect other people, that's not acceptable, I don't think. Someone that's a Christian might say, I'm not allowed to do this because I'm a Christian. But if they say, you're not allowed to do this because I'm a Christian, well, that's crossing a boundary that I don't think is a good thing.
Gotcha. Yeah. You found the place where you see things clearly from your standpoint and built a life that is consistent with that.
I'm trying to, yeah. I'm definitely not consistent with everything.
Sure. But that's the human condition.
Always a work in progress. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's beautiful. Well, thank you. Like I say, thank you for sharing all of that.
Sure. Yeah. I didn't expect for the conversation to go that direction, but hey, you know what? When you got two people talking about interesting stuff, you never know for sure which way it's going to go. That's all good.
Yes. And that's the beauty of questions, right? It's we follow them to where they go.
Yep.
Lovely. Knowing that we were going to have the conversation, do you have any other thoughts on questions that we hadn't necessarily touched on at all that you wanted to touch on?
When I get to the end of an episode or the end of a conversation with a guest, there are a couple of things that I usually ask. And other podcasters might find this handy. Sometimes I will ask, especially for people that have done more than one interview about this thing, the story that they're telling, I will ask them, when you do interviews like this, what are you always hoping the host will ask? But they don't usually. Because sometimes that might uncover something right there. And that
Absolutely.
could be a topic that could be interesting. And I almost always ask this question when we get to the end: is there any part of the story that we haven't talked about that you wanted to mention? Because maybe I didn't ask them about it. Maybe they have a couple of sentences in their notes that they want to make sure, and we never got to it. Because I want to make sure they get everything out. And I almost always ask those questions. Yeah.
Over the course of your episodes, I'm assuming that there have been some real nuggets that have come out as a result of those final questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There have been a few times. And in a few cases, if what they want to talk about doesn't really fit at the end of the episode because it like happened partway through their story or something, I'll just take that and put it back in a linear way where it fits in the story, depending on what the context is and everything. But yeah, you never know what you're going to get when you get one of those. And for most people, it's like, no, I think we covered everything. But every once in a while, you never know.
Yeah. It's cheap insurance. Just let's just make sure.
Right.
Cool.
And I think the guest appreciates it too, because that tells them, I want to make sure you get everything out that you wanted to say.
Right. Well, good deal. Where's the best place for folks to find out all the things that you're excited about and to be able to follow the work that you're doing?
Just do a search for the podcast name. What was that like? On any podcast app, it'll come up. But everything is at the website, and that's at whatwasthatlike.com. And if you go to podcasting conferences, you'll probably see me there.
And you'll be the guy wearing the hat with the question on it, and that don't necessarily stalk you in the bathroom, or at least wait until you're washing your hands at the sink. Yes.
Wait till I come out the door. Yeah, that'd be fine. I always have my hat on, has those words, what was that like? So I'm easily spotted.
Excellent. Well, Scott, thank you for pursuing your curiosity to find everyday people with incredible stories and sharing them with your ever-expanding audience. So thank you for sharing your curiosity and inquisitive insight with the Curated Questions community.
Thank you, Ken. It's been a joy. Wonderful conversation.
Ken here. I promised at the beginning we would cover a lot of ground and it would be unforgettable. I'm confident this conversation delivered. These are 4 takeaways I captured. What resonated with you? Number 1, from convenience questioning to intentional curiosity. Scott's transformation from asking surface-level questions to creating profound storytelling conversations reveal how intentional curiosity can unlock extraordinary human experiences. His evolution shows that while easy questions can start conversations, the real questions lie in being genuinely interested in the answers and following curiosity wherever it leads, even into deeply personal territory. Question: are you asking questions simply to fill conversational space? Or are you genuinely prepared to be changed by what you discover in the answers? Number 2, from individual curiosity to community transformation. Scott's Facebook group with 9,000 members demonstrates how curiosity-driven questions can foster communities that transcend divisions. By focusing on shared humanity through storytelling rather than divisive topics, he creates spaces where strangers become deeply connected through vulnerable sharing about universal human experiences. Question: how could your questions serve not just your own curiosity, but create space where others feel safe to be authentically human? Number 3, from protecting beliefs to pursuing truth, regardless of cost. Scott's religious deconstruction journey illustrates how genuine questioning can lead to fundamental identity shifts, even when the personal cost is enormous. His willingness to secretly research, questioning childhood indoctrination, and ultimately reshape his entire worldview demonstrates that authentic inquiry sometimes requires courage to follow evidence, even when it disrupts everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Question: what beliefs are you protecting from genuine examination because questioning them might require you to become someone different than who you've always been? Number 4, From avoiding trauma to finding purpose through pain. The stories Scott shares, like Laura losing both her son and husband in one day, then becoming an advocate for backseat safety technology, demonstrate how the most devastating experiences can become sources of profound purpose and service to others. His podcast reveals a pattern where survivors transform their deepest pain into a protective force for strangers they'll never meet. Often, our most significant wounds, when processed and shared courageously, can become our most powerful tools for preventing others' suffering and creating meaning from chaos. Question: what pain might you be able to recycle into a newfound purpose? I hope you enjoyed hearing from Scott and learning how the simple question, "What was that like?" captures the stories that reflect our shared humanity. To those on the other side of the speaker, thank you for being here. Gratitude shout out to Beauty Pill for the show's music and producer Ben Ford for the technical help. This episode was recorded on Piscataway land. Please engage with this episode in some manner. Download, follow, save, like, and share about something that resonated. This action ensures we are engaging the questioning community. Until next time, keep questioning.